Recording. Excellent. All right. Hello, everyone. Last class of the semester. So thank you for making it this far. We'll try to finish up sort of strong with the semester. So same basic idea as what we did last time. Feel free to unmute yourself whenever you need to ask a question or anything of that sort. There aren't that many of us, so it shouldn't be a problem. You can also send things through the chat. It might take me a little bit longer to get to them that way, but I'm also happy to and can easily respond to questions in that format too. What we're going to do today is sort of end up the semester by kind of going back a little bit to the beginning. Chapter 11 is a great place to sort of end with, because chapter 11 is, in a certain sense, all about what we sort of began the semester with. So we began with this idea of inquiry, with this idea of this sort of project or practice, maybe kind of an idealistic one, of people working together with no other motivation other than discovering what was true or false about the world, right? We all take ourselves to be rational. We all take ourselves to have good reasons for the things that we believe. And so inquiry is this process where we discover if we're right, if we discover where, in fact, we have indeed good reasons for our beliefs, and can correct things if we discover we don't, right? Change our beliefs to be more rational. Now, okay, all that's, though, a little idealized, right? And we've known this from the beginning. There's plenty of people who say things and don't seem to particularly care if what they're saying is true or false. Right? Maybe they're just trying to manipulate us. Maybe they're trying to deceive us in some sense, get us to do something, get us to go along with things for their own self-interest. Think of these as kind of various bad faith actors, right? People who want us to believe things without concern with whether what they're saying is true or false. But we also saw that despite people's best efforts, you might have people making every good and legitimate effort to discover the truth, to carry out a good inquiry, and still things go wrong. Right. And, we don't have to go far to find this. Turn on the evening news, go to Facebook, go to Twitter. You're going to find a lot of bad inquiry, right? Inquiries where things seem to have collapsed, maybe despite people's good faith efforts to do it well. One thing we've talked about for how to deal with this problem, we've been going through a series of logical fallacies, right? So sort of logical mistakes that can cause inquiries to go wrong. And that's fine and important and good and true. But very rarely is just pointing out to someone, hey, that's a logical fallacy. Like, that's not necessarily going to get the conversation back on track. Not necessarily going to get a good reaction from people. To just be told, hey, you're making a logical mistake. And that's because usually more is going on when a fallacy occurs than just the fallacy itself. More than just the logical error. There's usually something else going on underlying it, some feature of human psychology in some broad terms, and that's what we're going to talk about today in chapter 11. We're going to call these biases. Cognitive, social, psychological biases, features basically of how our brains work that can get in the way of inquiry. Not necessarily even bad things about how our brains work, but things that can cause inquiry to go off on the wrong track if we're not careful, if we don't correct it. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to look at two kinds of questions. First, we're just going to get good at recognizing these biases when they occur. And then the second thing we'll do, we'll also get practice sort of seeing how the biases and they go together with fallacies, how they sort of combine together. Do that as well. Have that analysis as well for the second half of what we'll talk about today. So that's pretty much all I have as an introduction. Your final exam will be next Wednesday for you all. You'll have the whole 24-hour period to do it within. Right now, my plan for you all, because you are your group one, your final exam will cover chapter 6, which was the appeals to authority stuff that we talked about last week, and it'll talk about this chapter 11 stuff that we're going to cover today. So your exams should be about 30-ish points with about 40-ish time to do it. I haven't finished completely writing the exam yet, but something like that. So this won't even be longer for you all than the exams you've done up to this point. It should be basically just the last exam in the semester. Someone's giving a party float, absolutely. And the only sort of cumulative part of it, you're going to need to know the logical fallacies, just because they're going to be part of some of the problems we're going to talk about today. If you go to the week 14 post-class assignments tab in Canvas, the module, you'll find two handouts. One is a list of all the biases that you'll need to know, and one is a list of all the fallacies that are fair game for the exam. So maybe print that out or whatever. You can use that to help you study. You can use it on the exam itself if you'd like. Anyone have any questions, thoughts, or comments about anything before we turn to the week 14 in-class activity? And again, remember, feel free to just unmute yourself or ask a question through chat. Either's fine. All right, awesome. Then let's just turn to the week 14 activity. Remember, this is just due by the end of the day, so treat it again just like as if we normally would do it in class. We're just going over it together. So let's look at number 1 together first, and for the rest of them, I'll give you a chance to sort of work through it on your own first. So we've got a series of biases. The psychological biases are basically features of how human emotional life works that can interfere with inquiry in some cases. Social biases are features of how groups interact that can, in some cases, interfere with inquiry. And the cognitive biases are basically features of how our brains process information that can, again, cause inquiry to go awry in certain cases. So let's look at number 1. So the belief in the existence in God is plainly irrational. There are numerous arguments that can be made to prove that God does not exist, given by notable philosophers and physicists. What do those who believe in God have to offer us? Just blind faith. Right. If we wanted to, we could characterize this indeed as a logical fallacy. You could say if this argument, if it's an argument, is committing a logical fallacy, it's committing the straw person fallacy. Right? I can tell you this firsthand. I'm someone here who's CSU. I teach philosophy of religion and medieval philosophy. Indeed, there are a great many philosophers, physicists, and theologians who indeed have arguments in which they try to prove that God does exist. Right? So this claim that the only justification for God's existence is blind faith is simply misrepresenting the reasons why at least many people who believe God exists have for their belief that God exists. But it seems as if more is going on than just that misrepresentation. We might wonder, why is that misrepresentation taking place in this case? This is an example of what we can call the psychological bias of the my side bias. Right? And so one way you could think about writing these out on the exam or whatever, treat it almost as if you're doing a fallacy. So first say what the my side bias is. So the my side bias is our tendency to just not really be aware of why people who disagree with us believe the things that they believe. And in and of itself, that kind of makes sense, right? So, I mean, our speaker in this case, you imagine it's someone who's either a sort of militant atheist or an agnostic. And if you ask, okay, well, why are they an atheist? Probably at least a big part of the reason why they're an atheist is because they've read these various arguments from the philosophers and the physicists that they at least interpret as proving that God doesn't exist. Right? And so, fine, if they had heard all these arguments from philosophers arguing God does exist, maybe they would have indeed formed a different belief. Right? It's perfectly understandable that we are more familiar with our side of some position than the other side. Where this becomes dangerous, though, where this becomes a problem, is that when, as a result, we tend to assume that people who disagree with us are just being irrational. Which is to say they don't have reasons for why they believe what they do. And that's what we see being manifested in our speaker in the argument here, right? The speaker very clearly is not aware of arguments that people have offered to establish that God does exist. Or indeed any other reason someone might have for their religious beliefs. And so as a result, they just assume that people just have blind faith, right? And when we say blind, what do we mean? We mean irrational faith. Faith that is not supported by any reasons, where indeed the overwhelming majority of religious people that I've ever talked to do indeed believe they have very good reasons for their faith. This person is just unaware of them, assuming the irrationality of people who disagree with them. All right. right. And so something more or less like this is what I'll be looking for in the exam in terms of how to answer it. What is the bias that's present within some exchange, and then give a sentence or two where you explain it. And you can maybe even, this might even be more than you would actually need to write for the exam itself, but something to this, something of this sort, at least, you can use as sort of a model. Does anyone have any questions about number one? All right, great. Then why don't we turn to number two? Do this yourself now. Figure out what bias is present. Give me a brief little explanation. Then we'll go over it together. All right. So again, this is another case where we could sort of characterize what's going on here in terms of a logical fallacy. You could read this argument as kind of a generalization. Where the conclusion is sort of like poverty doesn't hinder people in life, and the evidence is I was poor and I had success in life, something like that. And again, so we could call that the anecdotal evidence fallacy, right? A generalization that's formed on the basis of too few cases where someone's sort of privileging their own experience too much. They're giving it too much evidentiary weight. Fine, we could characterize the argument in that way. All that's good. But again, the question is almost more like, why is that taking place? Why is someone tempted by a fairly obvious example of the anecdotal evidence fallacy? And here we see an example of a cognitive bias, in this case, the cognitive bias of the representativeness. So again, let's sort of just define what this bias is. This is our tendency to assume that other people have had more or less the same experiences that we have had in life. And again, just in the abstract, that's not a bad thing. That's actually a really useful tendency in terms of how our brains process information. Let's say, I touch something and it's really, really hot and it hurts my hand. I'm going to warn you away from touching it because I'm going to assume you'll have the same experience if you touch it that I had. So that's valuable. It's how babies learn, right? It's assuming that other people are more or less mimicking back to the world to them in some important way. So fine, this tendency in and of itself isn't a bad thing. Where it becomes potentially dangerous is if it leads us, as it does in many cases, to dismiss people who have had really different experiences to the ones that we have had. And assume that maybe they're lying or they're exaggerating or misrepresenting or something, that something's gone wrong because obviously their experience has to be the same as mine, when indeed it's just possible that people can have really different experiences. And that's obviously what we see being manifested in this argument here, right? The speaker is simply assuming that everyone else has had more or less the same experience of poverty that they have had. But many people probably will report really different experiences. Right? And so by just sort of dismissing that or not even being open to looking for those different experiences, right, our speaker in this case is getting the inquiry off on the wrong foot. They're going to ignore a whole bunch of perhaps perfectly good evidence to establish that their conclusion maybe is incorrect or perhaps at the very least not formed with enough evidence. All right. So how are people feeling here? Anyone have any questions, thoughts, comments? Also, in the course of working on it, if anyone thought it was a different bias, you can bring that up as well. Some of these can be actually characterized in multiple respects. So if someone wanted to try out a different bias for this problem, this would also be a good chance to try it out. So anything anyone wants to raise?
What about the availability or vividness bias? Is that similar?
It could work a little bit, but it's probably not as strong. So availability and vividness are features of sort of my own experiences that cause me to overprivilege them. So you can maybe say, like, maybe if the experience, if for whatever reason, maybe like overcoming hardship or something, it's something they can really vividly remember. That could work maybe a little bit. But if I'm going to be not paying attention to other people's experiences, and that more seems like what's going on here than just paying too much attention to my own, that representative bias has to do with other people. Availability and vividness more has to do with myself and my own experiences. So if you wanted to say that this experience of successfully overcoming poverty is particularly vivid or something, that's not crazy by any stretch of the imagination. But just not be quite as strong as representative bias in this case. Does that help? Does that make sense? All right, good. Any others people want to try here? And by the way, we'll look at an example of the availability and vivid bias a little bit later on that will maybe make it even more clear how it's different, perhaps, as we sort of go through. All right, why don't we turn to number 3 now? Take a minute or so to look at number 3. All right. Again, here's another scenario where we could sort of characterize, we read this as an argument, I guess. We could interpret this as a logical fallacy. Maybe it's the fallacy of popularity, just assuming that sort of because lots of people do something, that's the right thing to do. But again, more seems to be taking place here. This was actually something I heard in a podcast, actually. There was a woman who was being interviewed who was one of the sort of first generation of female editors at a major newspaper. She worked for the Washington Post. And she was actually the one who was making this argument. She was suggesting that she thought it was really important that women in the workforce dress a certain sort of way. And she thought maybe that the younger generation wasn't doing that enough, or something like that. And so what seems to be taking place here is an example of actually a social bias, a feature of how groups work together, that's called inside the box thinking. This is a tendency of people within a group to almost just kind of assume that the traditions or customs that people have within the group are almost just not traditions and customs, almost forget why people do the things that they do. It's almost as if we sort of treat the things that we do within our groups as if they're just obvious and people have to do things that way. There's no other sensible way to do things. Think of this, maybe some of you, you went home for Thanksgiving and celebrated Thanksgiving with family. Maybe your family has various kinds of traditions and customs that they carry out in the course of that. But that's an example of a group when having traditions and customs. But a workplace is also a kind of group that has traditions and customs of various sorts. The danger here is sort of thinking that these traditions and customs are in some sense the way things have to be. That they're in some sense beyond challenging, beyond reproach, that they're things that can't actually be investigated. That's what we see being demonstrated by our speaker. In this case, the speaker is treating the almost just like the dress conventions of workplaces as if those were things that couldn't actually be investigated into. That's not necessarily to imply that customs and conventions should change, but they obviously could change. They do all the time. And maybe they should change. If we're going to have an inquiry, we have to at least be open to that possibility. And that openness is not really being manifested here, right? Because it's almost as if the customs were sort of like forgotten that they were actually customs, that they're treated as if they're something more than they actually are. All right. Does anyone have any questions, thoughts, comments on number 3? All right, great. Let's move on to number 4 then. All right. So this one would be hard to even characterize as a fallacy. Like we don't even arrive at the level of person B actually making an argument, I don't think, to even treat them as if they were committing a logical fallacy. Right? The error happens even sort of before you get to the point of inquiry. What we see here is the defensiveness bias. And this is our tendency to interpret any kind of criticism or critique as a personal attack. And importantly, even when they actually aren't. And why is that bad for inquiry? Well, that's bad for inquiry because it's going to cause us, as person B does in this case, to actually shift the topic away from this topic of the inquiry to talking about the individuals who are involved in the inquiry. And that's what happens here. This inquiry never even gets started. Person A is critiquing a conclusion that's reached in a paper. Person B interprets it as attacking themselves, right? And so as a result, the inquiry doesn't even start. The topic is shifted. And the inquiry doesn't even have a chance to begin because the topic has shifted to something kind of irrelevant. At best, maybe this is kind of a red herring fallacy or something. At best, if you're really generous and interpret B as making an argument here. All right. Any questions, thoughts, comments here on number 4? All right, great. Then let's switch to number 5. All right, so here we see an example of what's called ideological fixity. Think of, so maybe let's just define what I mean by an ideology first. Think of an ideology as like a framework for interpreting the world. Which in and of itself, that's not a bad thing at all. These frameworks can actually be quite useful. I mean, it's sort of like a weird example, but if I sort of like interpret the world in such a way that when I get sick, I go to a doctor, that's kind of like an ideology, right? Like that's a weird one. It's not a controversial one, but like it's kind of like an ideological framework that I use to navigate the world. What do I do when I get sick? How do I interpret that experience? Where ideologies become dangerous is if you forget that they themselves are things that need to be justified. I think of it, the problem of ideological fixity is the problem of always knowing the answer before the question even gets asked. And if that's the case, inquiries just can't even begin. Inquiry has to begin with some question that you're trying to answer. If you think you know all the answers to every question before you ask, you're not going to go anywhere with it. I mean, think of this maybe as an example of this. If any of you ever watch any of the sort of cable news personalities, we don't need to name names or anything, but there's lots of them where you almost don't even need to watch an episode to know what it is they're going to say, because they always say the same thing about whatever the news story is, right? They always adopt the same ideological framework, regardless of the topic, regardless of the stories of the day, right? And they don't justify why the lens that they're giving to the world is the right one, is the relevant one, to respond to the specific news of today. And that's what we see taking place very clearly with person B. Person B applies their sort of hawkish foreign policy position. To all situations without justifying why that ideological framework is the right one to respond to this specific crisis. Whereas presumably that's precisely the thing that would actually be most relevant in an inquiry, would be figuring out what is the right framework to interpret this specific incident. All right, any questions, thoughts, comments about number 5? You could also maybe characterize this one as a desire for certainty. I don't think it's quite as strong. But you could sort of read maybe this last sentence as suggesting that person B sort of just like wants to have figured out the whole foreign policy thing, right? They want to have it figured out. Desire for certainty is basically our tendency to want to have things figured out, to not be willing to sort of unsettle beliefs in various sorts of ways. That's relevant here. I just think almost ideological fixity explains the precise way in which that desire for certainty is taking place. It's taking place here through the kind of ideological fixity. The ideology is the way in which the person is trying to make the world certain for themselves. So any questions, thoughts? All right, then let's turn to one last example of this first kind of problem on the exam. So number 6 will be our last one of these first problem sets. So look at that one now. All right, so here we see an example of the cognitive bias of overconfidence. Again, this is a feature sort of how we process information almost, right? So there's sort of two sides of this. So this is our tendency to, one, to be more confident that our beliefs are true than the evidence actually supports. We saw with a lot of inductive arguments that they give us some reason to believe that the conclusion is true, but that doesn't necessarily the same thing as being 100% certain that the conclusion is true, right? And that there's degrees of this. I can conclude on average with maybe 51% certainty that something is the case, that I should still be reasonably reluctant to change the belief. In the first case, I'm more confident than the evidence actually supports. The other possibility, and this is the one that's more relevant in this case, is that I can adopt a more extreme version of some belief than that the evidence actually supports. And that's more what's relevant in this particular case. If you want to think about it, why is this occurring? Why do we humans have this tendency? It's because when we act, our actions really do need to be all or nothing, right? So I'm either going to drink this coffee or I'm not going to drink it. Those are the only two choices. Right? I need to go all one way or all the other way, practically speaking. But the same thing doesn't have to be true about our beliefs. Our beliefs can be more nuanced in some ways than our actions can actually be. I can decide not to drink this cup of coffee without concluding that it will therefore kill me. I adopt the more moderate position. That's what we see person A failed to do in this case. Right, person A adopts the extreme belief that coffee is deadly. But the evidence only supports the conclusion that some people who drink extreme amounts of coffee should maybe drink less. And so they've adopted a more extreme version of the belief than is actually supported, but from what it is that the scientific evidence suggested. All right. Any last questions, thoughts, comments on number 6 or any of these first 6 questions? All right. So there'll be problems in the exam that look just like those. And do more or less what I just did there, right? Identify what bias is being expressed or demonstrated by some exchange, and then 1 or 2 sentences explain why. Maybe what is the bias? How is it being shown here? Something like that. Fine. But there's going to be another set of problems that are like 7, 8, and 9 on the activity that are a little bit longer, a little bit more involved, and are more representative of almost what I think sort of applying this logic stuff we've been talking about in the real world. Like I've been saying, in the real world, people don't usually react great if you just point out, hey, that's a logical fallacy. Hardy, hardy, hard, right? Like that just sounds like a smart aleck. No one likes that. That's not going to get a conversation back on track usually. And indeed, usually more is going on than just that logical mistake. If you can't respond to sort of the bias that's leading people into these fallacies, you're not going to get the conversation reoriented in a positive way. So the next set of problems, you're going to have 3 things that I'm going to ask you to do, basically. First, I'm going to ask you to do the same thing, identify what bias is being manifested. Also identify what logical fallacy is being committed in the argument. And then the third thing, come up with a response that addresses both the fallacy and the bias. So don't just point out the bias, don't just point out the fallacy, respond to both of them in an effort to get the inquiry put back on track. So that'll be the other kind of problem that occurs in the exam. Those will be quite a bit longer. They'll be worth quite a bit more points. You should spend quite a bit more time on them. Let's look at number 7 as an example of this. So maybe take a real quick, maybe 1 minute at least, look at number 7, at least try to identify the bias and the fallacy, and then we'll come up with a response to it together. All right, so here let's maybe start with the logical fallacy that we see manifested here. Here we have a clear case of the slippery slope fallacy. It's very unlikely that taking care of a crying baby is going to lead that baby to end up in jail. Right? And the argument doesn't really do anything to establish why such a connection is the case. Right. And indeed, it's sort of an obvious version of slippery slope fallacy, right? It's pretty obvious that these two things are probably not going to go together. So the question is almost, why then is this person falling into this obvious mistake? And here it seems as if it's the result of the availability and vividness bias. So this bias is our tendency, we talked about it a little bit earlier, but we can go over it again. This is our tendency to almost just like overprivilege things that we can really easily remember, right? Either because we really easily remember them just because we happen to be able to recall the information more quickly, that's the availability side of it, or because it was a really sort of important experience or a memorable experience, that's the vivid side of it. And that seems to be what's taking place here. The speaker seems to have a very vivid, clear memory of their brother being spoiled and ending up in jail. And as a result of that, there seems to be a pretty clear connection here, right? Because they can really powerfully remember that experience, they're giving it kind of an undue evidentiary weight. They're giving it too much evidential worth. And that's what's leading into the slippery slope fallacy, right? How they're connecting things that on the surface don't seem as if they really go together that well. If you wanted to get the conversation back on track, you sort of would need to respond to both of these. There's lots of ways you could do this. I'm just going to give you one example. You obviously wouldn't have to write the exact same thing that I'm writing here in an exam. This is just an example. The kind of thing maybe you could say to respond to both. Maybe something like this. Maybe something like, I know you had a really bad experience with your brother when you were young. And I agree, it's really important that we not spoil our child. But, if we just take care of the child when they cry, that's not the same thing as spoiling them, though. And it's certainly not going to lead to the same thing that happened to your brother. Here we sort of hit both sides of it, right? With this first part, we're sort of like recognizing and acknowledging that that experience was indeed important, that they can vividly recall it, take it seriously, almost like acknowledge like, yeah, there's some truth to the moral of that experience, that like spoiling people maybe is dangerous or something, and yet still then undermining the fallacy too, right? Because basically that's basically what's taking place the second half here, pointing out that it is indeed a logical mistake, right? And not asking the person, the speaker, not to over privilege the experience just because they can vividly recall it. Like I said, this is just an example. There's other ways of doing this too. But anyone have any questions or thoughts or comments on number 7? All right, then let's look at number 8. Number 8 is sort of like, I would sort of call like if any of you are Office fans, number 8 is sort of the Michael Scott example. So try it out yourself. All right, so here we see an example of the red herring fallacy. All right, certainly. And red herring fallacy is where you bring up a bunch of irrelevant information. So in this case, right, bringing up the quality of the products and the customer service just has nothing to do with the issue of whether or not the employees should get raises. It's irrelevant. It's just a distraction tactic. That's the essence of the red herring fallacy, is where you try to distract attention away from something. All right, so why might this red herring fallacy take place in this case? Well, look, it could be being deployed strategically, maybe, right? Maybe we have a manager here who's just trying to manipulate their employees. That sort of thing certainly happens. Distract them from the injustice of a situation by bringing up irrelevant stuff. Possible. But in this case, we see a little bit more, I think. We also see what's called identification of beliefs. It seems to be really important to this manager that people think that he's a good manager and that the company is a good company. Right? Hence the sort of the office reference in this context. Right? And that tendency is causing the manager to sort of just not want to look at things that call that belief into question. And that's precisely what you would do if you spend too much time thinking about the fact that you're not giving your employees any raises. And so you bring up a bunch of irrelevant stuff, but that stuff that is relevant in establishing that maybe you are a good manager or that the company is a good company. Right? And so to respond, you have to respond to both. You have to reorient the conversation back to the actual topic to correct the red herring, but also perhaps like push a little bit at this manager's belief that indeed he is a good manager and that the company is a fair company. Maybe something like this could do it, right? If the company is as good as you say, then shouldn't the employees receive raises as a reward for all of their hard work? Again, we sort of do double duty here. We respond to the logical fallacy, we shift the conversation to what's actually relevant, the raises, so we get back on topic. And we point out the sort of almost like the kind of cognitive dissonance that at play, that if you think yourself as a good manager and that the company is a good company, then shouldn't you treat your employees better? Okay? Try to respond to sort of both sides of the fallacy, or both sides to the mistake, to the failed inquiry. Any thoughts, questions, comments about this one? All right, great. Then let's do one last problem for the day. Number 9, last one of the semesters. Take a minute or two, look at number 9. Okay, so what fallacy do we see here? Well, we see the post hoc fallacy. Again, this is pretty obvious example. It's pretty good. It's another case where it seems really obvious that something has gone wrong. Right? Why is this a post hoc fallacy? Well, the only evidence that's presented for why the bird is the cause of the computer to crash is that the bird flew by before the computer crashed. Right? And in this case, the bird's not even a credible causal candidate for the computer to explain why the computer crashed. So we pretty obviously have a mistake here. Something's pretty obviously gone wrong. Why has this mistake taken place? Here it seems to have been caused by what gets called confirmation bias. This is so confirmation bias, just in general, what is it? It's our tendency to only look for evidence that confirms what we already believe, and to be sort of dismissive of evidence or to reject evidence that contradicts our pre-established beliefs. And so we see that in this case, right, the speaker is only looking at times that they had bad experiences with animals. And so they're only looking at times that confirm their superstitious hypothesis that animals are unlucky. And so that is why the confirmation bias is at play here. And so our response is going to have to both point out that the fallacy has been committed, but also try to undermine the confirmation bias that's at play in how this person is processing information, try to get them to look at evidence that indeed does not just confirm the hypothesis they've already established. Maybe something like this could work. And if you, yeah. Maybe something like this, but surely you've had plenty of experiences with animals where nothing bad happened that you just aren't thinking about. The bad cases are probably just coincidences, just like happened with this bird, right? So you point out that the bird flying by is probably just coincidentally connected or correlated with the computer crashing in this particular case. So you respond to the logical fallacy, but you also try to get the person to almost just like remember past their confirmation bias, to look at evidence, to consider evidence that they've perhaps been dismissing up to this point because it didn't agree with their sort of pre-existing hypothesis. All right. So any questions on number 9 or anything else that we've talked about today? All right. Well, so this is our last class session of the semester. I want to thank you all for all of your good work. This has been quite the semester. Frustrating, difficult, challenging in all kinds of different ways. I really appreciate the work you put in. Another thing, it looks like next semester in the spring is probably going to more or less look the same as this semester, though I'm hopeful that spring will be the last one. Hopefully by next fall, at least, things will be back to more or less normal. Or at least something close to it anyway. As a result, I'm going to have to use the same hybrid structure that I used this semester and some logic classes in the spring. And so I always value student feedback from course surveys, but I actually would really like it even more this semester. It's even more important because I've never done a hybrid class like this before. I'd really like to know what you thought worked, what didn't work, how I could change things to better meet your needs. Because I have to do the same thing next semester, so I'd really like to improve it because I'm sure there's all kinds of grounds for improvement. I have lots of things that this is not how I would have ideally liked to have taught this class. So how I can change it given the constraints that we're under to make it better, I super value that feedback from all of you. The course surveys should be available on Canvas. They should be ready to go. So I'll probably send out a couple of reminders about that. Otherwise, I'll post one more video probably on Wednesday, just kind of an end of the semester summation video, go over sort of big picture stuff, maybe go over the final a little bit. But other than that, that'll be it for us. So thank you all very much. Have a great rest of your semester. I got office hours if you want to go over anything for the exam. And otherwise, I'll talk to you all later. Thank you all very much. Have a good one.